So I'm sure many of you are aware of the recent scandal involving Red Bull and the cost cap. For the first time in Formula One's cost cap era, a team has broken the rules and received a punishment. And because it's the first time this has ever happened, the effect of the FIA's decision is huge because it sets a crucial precedent for how future breaches will be dealt with. So the question everyone's asking is, were the punishments harsh enough? Were they harsh enough to deter other teams from ever breaking the rules again? Well, it's a hotly contested debate, and one where there is a lot to consider. So for this video, I'll break down a bit what the cost cap is about, what happened with Red Bull, and finally, what the future of the cost cap entails. Now firstly, for those that aren't entirely clued up on the cost cap, it's basically a set of financial regulations that were brought in 2021 to try and create a closer and more competitive field and try and reduce the influence of money in deciding the pecking order of Formula One teams. And basically how it works is the teams have to reduce their spending below a certain limit. In 2021, this limit was $145 million. For 2022, this went down to $140 million, and for 2023 onwards, it's going to be $135 million. But the cost cap doesn't limit all spending for the teams. It mainly and only involves spending to do with the car performance benefits. So that would be car design and development, testing components and manufacturing components, testing and race operations, and finally, the majority of employee salaries. And basically, if the teams spend over this limit, then they are punished proportionally to the breach that they made. So for example, spending below 5% over the limit results in a certain set of punishments such as reduced testing time, fines, points deductions, or just a basic reprimand. But spending over 5% over the limit results in even more severe punishments such as more severe points reductions and testing reductions and even disqualification from the championship. So what exactly happened with Red Bull's recent breach? Well, they only overspent by around $2 million, meaning they come under that 5% bracket. And so they could have been punished in the following ways: a reprimand, a fine, a reduction in drivers and or constructors' points, reduction in testing, exclusion from competitions, and even a reduction in Red Bull's individual cost cap. Well, after weeks of waiting for the FIA to decide, they finally punished Red Bull with a $7 million fine and a 10% reduction in aerodynamic wind tunnel testing time. Now, in terms of the fine, fines actually aren't included in the cost cap, so that won't affect Red Bull in really any way possible. But that wind tunnel testing reduction is not so simple. Now, at face value, it seems like Red Bull will only get a 10% reduction in testing. But in reality, it's actually a little bit more than that. You see, Formula One have this thing called the wind tunnel testing sliding scale, which is basically where the higher you rank in the championship, the less time you have to test on the car in a wind tunnel. So basically, the team that finishes last from the season before gets 115% wind tunnel testing time. And this then reduces 5% by each position in the championship until you get to first place that gets 70%. So while it states that Red Bull get 10% less than the others, in reality it's actually 12% less than whoever comes second in the championship before. And what this means is 38 fewer wind tunnel tests and 200 CFD items less to test on over the next 12 months. So whichever way you look at it, it will have a negative effect on Red Bull's development for the 2023 and even 2024 car. But the main thing everyone is asking is, were the punishments harsh enough? And it's certainly split opinions across the board. Some say it was quite lenient and it only means Red Bull will have to scratch their heads a bit harder, but other people believe their rival teams can't really complain. One online poll showed that 50% of people believed the punishment was too lenient, with 14% only saying it was the correct punishment. Well, whichever way you look at it, it sets an extremely important precedent moving forward for the cost cap. You see, because it's the first set of financial regulations of its kind, it sets a standard for punishments to come when other teams make breaches as well. So if the FIA wanted the cost cap to have any effect, they needed to stamp down on Red Bull hard. There should be no temptation at all for other teams to breach the cost cap strategically because they think the punishments are worth the risk. So with that being said, what do the other teams think of Red Bull's punishments? Well, it's also split opinions. Well, firstly, Toto, unsurprisingly, has been very vocal about the punishments, but not in such a critical way. Toto basically said that if Mercedes were to break the cost cap, the risk of reputational damage wasn't worth it. And he also said he was actually quite impressed with how the FIA governed the whole process in actually giving punishments out to Red Bull. Ferrari boss Mattia Binotto wasn't so relaxed, however. He firstly said that the fine was completely useless, which is realistically true, and that the wind tunnel testing reduction would not have as big an effect than we think it would, because Red Bull could simply just spend the money they would have spent on wind tunnel testing on a different component of the car. McLaren boss Andreas Seidel also believes the punishment was a bit too lenient and wants to see harsher penalties moving forward, while Alpine team principal Omar Zafnauer thinks it's actually a pretty fair punishment. So all in all, there's split opinions among the fans, experts, and even their rival teams. So the real question is, what is going to happen moving forward? Well, firstly, if Red Bull were to breach the cost cap again, then they will certainly get a harsher penalty. But for other teams, they now know what kind of punishments result from what kind of breaches. But the main thing we're all wondering is, will the teams risk getting punishments in order to improve their cars by spending more than the cost cap? In other words, will the loss in testing affect the teams enough to mean they drop positions in the championship? Well, my quick answer is I highly doubt the teams will risk it. And if that does begin to happen a bit more, then I'm sure the FIA are going to stamp down a lot harder. After all, we still don't really know how the FIA are going to act in the future in terms of future breaches. The main thing I hope is that the process for giving these punishments and managing these breaches becomes a lot quicker and a lot more efficient. Because if anything, it just looks bad on Formula 1.